It's an ongoing argument that has increasingly gained traction over the years as South Africa desperately tries to find solutions to the country's ailing economy. What is the role of the South African Reserve Bank in post-democratic South Africa? Good evening, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Last week in Parliament, Reserve Bank Governor Lesitja Kganyago attempted to defend the bank's Palapala scandal investigation, basically absolving President Cyril Ramaphosa of any wrongdoing after the bank curiously concluded that the transaction was not perfected. Added to this is the bank and policymakers' persistence with its inflation targeting policy, amidst calls for it to be more responsive to the country's context. But who is the South African Reserve Bank accountable to? Joining me for this discussion are Secretary General of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Zwelinzima Vavi. We also have Professor Dani Meyer from the Department of Public Governance at the University of Johannesburg, as well as the Freedom Foundation's Leon Lowe. We did reach out to the Reserve Bank, but they couldn't join us. Remember to send us your views on the app X using our handle @Unfiltered. Let's watch this insert produced by Genosi Kwene.
Chairperson, I detest it with passion generally when people come to us and they treat us like we're stupid. We are anything but stupid. For an example, this thing, the intention here is to, I don't know what, Bubsela or Chairperson, cloaked in regulations and nice English, but this is unadulterated claptrap, if you ask me.
The authorities are busy giving us a whitewash because they're busy focusing us on the system, and they're saying, as far as with the information at our disposal, what is information at that disposal is what the system tells them. But why are they looking at the system when the money is not in the system, is in the sofa?
We treat our mandate seriously. As the governor, with the deputy governors, we kept an arm's length from the investigation. And, they tabled the report to us as the executives of the bank, and we accepted it. We sought outside legal counsel on the report. We asked questions, and we got satisfied that our team acted professionally, with integrity, and they acted independently and without fear, favor, or prejudice.
The role and accountability of the Reserve Bank of South Africa came under scrutiny last week in Parliament as it presented its findings on the Palapala scandal. This time, lawmakers believe the bank has allowed itself to be used for political reasons, contrary to its expected independence. The latest in the complaints against the bank, which for a long time has been criticized for ignoring the plight of South Africans as it insists on its inflation targeting policy. At issue is whether the Reserve Bank's constitutional mandate should be expanded to also target employment and reduce poverty. Currently, the bank is mandated by the Constitution to stabilize the value of the currency. But opponents of inflation targeting demand a flexible central bank that will answer to the triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. We no longer make profit. We only work for transport, and things are expensive at the market.
I get 350 rands because I don't yet receive a pension grant.
And while salaries remain stagnant, prices of goods and services continue to rise.
We must have people on that monetary policy committee who feel the pain of ordinary South Africans when they make those decisions about what to do about interest rates, about growing the economy and so on.
Whereas pro-markets advocates insist on the independence of the Reserve Bank, conferences of the governing African National Congress repeatedly resolved to change the bank's ownership, mandate, independence, and committee composition. But it later took a position not to proceed with the move to change ownership due to the high cost required in order to buy back the shares from private shareholders.
For us here, the issue about ownership is really a distraction. That's not a conversation really that we should be having. The conversation that South Africans should be having is this conversation about the state of this economy and how we get more people included in ordinary economic activity.
The state has already failed to meet its National Development Plan's target to reduce unemployment to 14% by 2020. To accelerate economic performance following the COVID-19 setbacks, it has introduced its Recovery and Reconstruction Plan to, among others, use debt to generate high growth. And while the outcomes of that strategy are yet to be realized, struggling small business owners like Jamila Kasim say the expected recovery might be too little too late, as high interest rates and labor costs, as well as increasing prices of petrol used to run generators during load shedding, have already forced them to downsize staff.
The current state with load shedding, inflation, things have been not too good.
The family-owned hardware store has been running for 30 years. They are now worried they may have to permanently shut doors. As South Africans try to survive each day as it comes amidst tough economic times, the question remains, who is the Reserve Bank accountable to? Kinosi Kwene, Unfiltered, on the SABC channel 404.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're talking the South African Reserve Bank, which has recently been in the spotlight, both for decisions to raise interest rates, but also the recent Palapala report. And we're asking, how accountable is the Reserve Bank? Mr. Vavi, can I start with you? The Palapala report, of course, involves an important office bearer and the president. But the way that the Reserve Bank treated its segment of this investigation came under increasing spotlight. What did you make of its handling of this investigation and the subsequent publication of a statement and not a full release of its report?
Well, in our view, by the time they went to publicize their report, they have lost all of the credibility because of the time they took to come back to the public and say, here is the results of our investigation. The second part, they lost the credibility because South Africans have been debating the matter in their spaces, including social media, and they have seen a president making bold statements that he is a farmer and that he is selling animals. And all of us who have lived here know the type of figures that he has been associated with in terms of the amount of money he has to afford his buffaloes at 18 million, 27 million, and even 54 million rands and all of that. What we can't believe is the story, the narrative that says, look, there was some Sudanese business person who came to South Africa with lots of cash in his bag, who didn't declare it on arrival, and then who proceeded to go to the Palapala farm and found a farm manager who gave the money, and but wouldn't take the buffaloes back to Sudan. But the money, weeks after it has been handed over, is stuck in the sofas and not in the bank. The question that everybody will ask is, what if it was Zwelinze Mavavi or Mr. Lowe or you, Sizwe, who would have kept that amount of money in foreign currency in your sofas, to the point that even workers will see that there's money here when they sit down. There's all manner of dollars that makes them to sit uncomfortably in that sofa. What will the Reserve Bank do? What will the police do? What will all these other state institutions do to you? And that's the crux of the matter in relation to this matter. Now, we do accept that the Reserve Bank, apparently in their rule book, have found this imperfect transaction that says unless the goods have been moved, the transaction remains imperfect, and therefore they've used that technicality to clear the president. But unfortunately, they've done that at the technical level, and they are able to say that to parliamentarians. But most of South Africans do not buy that story. And the result of that is that the credibility of the Reserve Bank at this moment is at its lowest than it has to be in its history, basically, as a Reserve Bank.
Mr. Lowe, the Reserve Bank, for all the disagreements about policy, has always been seen as a relatively effective institution in South Africa. Do you think this report has in some ways tainted that image of the Reserve Bank's credibility, or do you in fact think that its credibility has allowed this statement to at least survive to the extent that it has?
Yes, I think it's extremely unfortunate, and I agree with Willem that there was technicality, and everyone knows and cares about the substance. And I also agree on how he and I and you would have been treated differently, probably. But also we must bear in mind what Nzima said was by other state agencies, other organs of state. Where are they? Why aren't they involved? You know, the criminal investigation people, the financial investigator, the FICA, the SAPS, National Prosecuting Authority. So there's a silence, I think, from organs of state, which is disturbing. And as to the technicalities of the finding, as a lawyer, I'm in favor of upholding the rule of law. In other words, if that's what it says, then rule accordingly, however unfortunate. And the trouble with the rule of law is it sometimes doesn't get the consequence we wanted. There's a separate question for me, though. Should the state president have resigned in view of the findings and in view of the facts of this matter? And I'm not a political person. I don't want to express opinion on that. That's the question I asked. So I agree with the technical reading of the law, but let's understand this foreign exchange control law is not just an apartheid law that came in 1960s to stop people leaving the country. It was a Nazi law. It's a Nazi idea. So we sit with these regulations which were never passed in Parliament. They were made by decree, and they live today, 30 years after apartheid. And when you say it's been reasonably well respected over the years, no. During the early PW years, it's poured money into the economy before the election and was acknowledged as having been an election ploy. And that is the problem if it is politically controlled. The problem is then it does political things. Then it tries to manipulate the outcome of elections, and it tries to manipulate interests. So it's a long answer to a short question. The short answer is, I think it's unfortunate that it has left people unsatisfied. I think it's unfortunate that it had to be a finding on what seemed, on my reading, to be a correct reading of the technicality. And technicalities, unfortunately, often decide the outcome of legal procedures. And that's in fact what lawyers are trained to do. I'm a lawyer. You're trained to look for the technicality with which you can trip up the opposition.
It's a fair perspective. And Professor Meyer, I'm interested in your thoughts, particularly on the way that this statement has affected the credibility in the eye of the reasonable South African, of the SARB itself, quite apart from the president, because we've spoken about the Palapala matter in some ways ad nauseum, but the SARB has come into a new spotlight because of this issue and the way it has investigated. What are your thoughts on that statement?
I think, as was said, the statement wasn't very satisfactory. It wasn't so clear what happened exactly with the foreign currency in the house of the president. And if the president wasn't guilty of anything, who was the guilty party that came in and left the money there? So somebody else must have been part of this. So I think it is not very clear. It's like the statement the president made on the Lady R ship of an unloading of the weapons. It said that it was very classified weapons and so on. But we should know. I think the public has the right to know the details of everything. And it's the same case with the Reserve Bank finding. We need to have all of the details. And in my opinion, the Reserve Bank has got a very good reputation in South Africa and globally. But in the last, let's say, few years, they've taken some strange decisions that we as academics and the public are not 100% sure of their direction, what they are taking at this point of time.
That's an interesting point, and can I just stick with you and ask about the decision not to release this report and the way it was communicated in that statement? I think to some extent the SARB said in its statement their hands were tied. Certain regulations, which they didn't actually enumerate, prevented them from doing so. But with such a public investigation, to just give almost a one-liner to the South African public seemed that they didn't quite appreciate the gravity of the statement they were putting out. What do you make of that suggestion?
No, I agree. The public, we expect transparency and openness from government, and other political parties, the opposition parties, are looking to take this further. There's other agencies that must investigate the situation, and there's more to it. I think it was not, the whole story wasn't told to the public yet. So we need to have all of the information, and that is our right in terms of the Constitution.
Mr. Vavi, the question of secrecy looms large here, and the question of an attempt to conceal certain aspects of the report from the public. And we're only told at the end, a year later, oh, by the way, you won't see the report. There was something about that communication which just seemed strange.
You were referring to the Lady R investigation?
No, the statement, the Palapala
It seems to
statement.
be the same thing to me. In fact,
well.
what it does in the public mind is that the government have found a way of escaping accountability using this commission of inquiry. And look at how they are really destroying the reputation of any future commission of inquiry. Look at the Zondo Commission. Look at what it recommended and the amounts of money that were involved in maintaining, setting it up, and that were spent. And then look at the results and against the recommendations. Now you have this commission to look at the Palapala, totally discredited. You have Lady R on Sunday. We're being told that, look, you don't deserve to know. And it seemed like this Reserve Bank investigation, all you need to know is that the government is clean. The president has come out clean in this investigation. But please don't ask for the report itself. That is for us, your rulers, only his eyes, and not for you, the voters, who put us into the positions that we're occupying. It's scandalous. And look at now, in the wake of the fire in Johannesburg, the Premier of Gauteng has announced that there will be another commission of inquiry to find out why the mayor, the MMCs, and the staff of Johannesburg Metro that they lead didn't implement the bylaws that they passed. And so we must now have a commission of inquiry. And nobody is going to resign, not over the fire, not over the Lady R, not over the Reserve Bank fumbling report, or Palapala. No accountability, none whatsoever.
Right.
And that's the crisis of credibility and of lack of integrity generally that we are facing in our politics.
Indeed. We're going to come back to questions of policy after this. The Palapala report, of course, put the Reserve Bank in the spotlight for its handling of that investigation. But there are serious questions as well about interest rates, the policy of inflation targeting. And when we come back, we're going to analyze the wisdom of the Reserve Bank's recent decisions in that regard. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. The South African Reserve Bank is a crucial institution to South Africa's economy, to its society and its politics. And today we're asking, who is the South African Reserve Bank accountable to? Is it accountable enough? And Mr. Lowe, we were talking about the recent Palapala report, which set tongues wagging, to put it mildly. But of course, the SARB has a much wider mandate than these investigations which it conducts. The decision to raise interest rates and the policy of inflation targeting has come under increased scrutiny because of the hardships faced in the economy at the moment. What are your thoughts on the wisdom of the SARB's policy position as regards monetary policy and targeting inflation so doggedly?
Well, let's first be clear what the central banks do is they issue currency. And they do a few other things like forex controls, which they should have abandoned long ago. It's actually not the bank's choice. It's the Department of Finance that decides on forex controls, and the Reserve Bank implements them. And they should have been repealed in the, in the 70s. And in fact, there's been talk of repealing them all along, always. They talk about phasing them out. But they hang around. This apartheid dinosaur, or neo-Nazi dinosaur hangs around our necks, and it should go. And then the whole Palapala thing would be another set of questions. And I think absolutely correctly, strange acts have taken place and they should be investigated and prosecuted. But the Reserve Bank has no choice at the moment but to use inflation targeting because its job, its mandate, and people want to change its mandate. Now we'll get into why they want to change it, which is actually suspicious. But its mandate is to provide a stable exchange rate and a stable currency. Now, to show you the extent to which it's important to have this, is our rand has fallen 95% since 1994. People don't understand that we've had a catastrophic collapse of the value of our currency, and it should try to prop it up. It's got inflation targeting of up to 6%, which is targeting, in my view, far too much. It should target 0 or 1 or 2% as the amount of inflation. Now, why does it use inflation? Because people might not know this, but basically it provides however much money the commercial banks want through the discount window, and it simply sets an interest rate, which means they draw more or they draw less. Now, people who want to have lower interest rates and want to get rid of inflation, complaint of which we saw in the segment, are very confused. If you want lower interest rate, it means you want higher inflation. And so what they should be doing is targeting, doing their job, and other people have the job of job creation and economic growth and agriculture and everything else, equality, and those are macroeconomic policies are important. So the Reserve Bank...
Can I just ask you there on that? Because some economists have disputed the sort of one-to-one relationship, which maybe you posit there between inflation and interest rates, and that maybe the SARB has been a little bit too arrow-focused on that relationship, where in fact there are many dynamics that drive inflation, and interest rates are only one of them. So the way that corporations decide to set their prices is often not exactly linked to the price of money at a given time.
Yes, it is complicated.
So I just wonder about that relationship that you posit there, and whether the bank has been a little too overzealous in drawing that relationship.
I think we do need to understand very clearly that the bank has no control over what people charge. Inflation is not rising prices, it's falling money. It's the value of the currency crashing, not the prices rising. The price of potatoes compared to gas, compared to shoes, compared to TV programs stays the same. So prices are very, very stable. The ratio, what you pay in order to watch this program, or what you pay in order to buy food, relative to the hours of work, stays much the same. What happens is the quantity of money you must use rises. And why does it rise? It's because the Reserve Bank has been increasing the quantity of money too much.
Okay, let's bring in Mr. Vavi there. What's your view on the Reserve Bank's policy position, and do you think it's been wise in the same way that
Firstly,
Mr. Lowe?
In response to your first question, who are they accountable to? The response is very simple. They are accountable to their shareholders. And their shareholders are mainly in the private sector. And the fellows in the private sector do not invest their money in the Reserve Bank in order to create jobs or to uplift the poor from their poverty or to address the crisis of inequalities in society. Any entrepreneur who invests their money do that for a sole purpose of maximizing the profit, full stop. So if you ask the question, who are they accountable to the profits that the investors in the Reserve Bank are looking to achieve? That's the first one. The second question, have they been successful in their policy? We normally say that they should say when we've seen them beating their chest to say that, yeah, we are doing well. It's typically a statement that will be made by a doctor after an operation. That will basically say the operation has been very successful, but unfortunately, the patient have died. If you look at today's news in particular from the Statistics South Africa, they're telling us that for the second time in this quarter, or the second quarter of 2013, we have seen a 0.6% increase in our economy. In the first quarter, we had a 0.4% increase. Since and before COVID-19, we have been zigzagging between 0 point something and or recession.
Can I ask you on that, Mr. Vavi, because Governor Kganyago, this has been put to him, and he says, well, I don't have very many levers that I can pull, and the main lever I can pull is this interest rate lever. So is it maybe unfair to the SARB to say, well, other parts of the economy aren't working when they only have access to a certain lever that they can pull to try and influence the wider economy?
You're raising a question earlier about how they interpret their price stability mandate. We've been one of those from SAFTU, in fact, arguing, firstly, that the ownership of the Reserve Bank must change. It must belong to the people of South Africa as a whole. It must be accountable to the poor of the poorest. It must be accountable to the working class. And just like it must be accountable to the entrepreneurs who are investing their money in the economy. For now, the Reserve Bank is only serving strictly the moneyed class in society, leading to the situation that we normally put out to say, if you are super rich, the Reserve Bank will serve you well through its inflation targeting policy and through it using the hammer of interest rates to punish anybody who wants to borrow money. But it comes very nicely to those who have money in the bank. If you are poor, the Reserve Bank will punish you as we speak, the middle class, the working class, and any small, medium, macro enterprises who wants to enter into the space and to grow have to pay a 11.75% for any car, for any house bond, for anything that you need of quality that you may not have cash to buy. Often, the working class and the middle class do not have cash in the bank to buy things like that. So you will then be pushed deeper into the grave if you are poor. That's the crux of the problem of the monetary policies in South Africa.
Let me come to Professor Meyer. We have a minute to break, but we will come back to you after the break. Professor Meyer, what's your view, having heard the divergent views from the panel so far on Reserve Bank monetary policy?
Now, if you've got a short time, there's a number of issues here. The Reserve Bank is very conservative. So they work within their 3 to 6% target band for inflation. Anything above that, they will aggressively target the interest rates, and that's their only tool that they've got. So over the last 12 years, they've been very, very successful in keeping us in a low inflation environment. But a low inflation environment means a low growth environment. So there's a lot of questions on how they do this, and their mandate in terms of the Constitution also refers to economic growth. So I would say that their single target of inflation is not the way to go. It's been set in the year 2000, the 3 to 6% target rate. And we have done some research to prove that that midpoint of 4.5% of inflation is too low for South Africa to have higher levels of growth. So we are targeting too low. We can have a much higher growth rate if we have got a higher midpoint of the inflation target point, which should be at about 6%. But they've been very successful in keeping us at a very low inflation rate. The last 12 years was about 5.1% average inflation. And for a developing country, that is very low. But you can see our growth in the last 3-4 years was 0.2, 0.4, sometimes recession. We cannot get out of that low growth grip of the economy with the current policies that we've got, as well as our economic policies. We hear nothing from the Minister of Trade and Industry on his plans of action, for example. So there's a lot of things that we can improve.
Right, and we will come back. We will come back to you after the break on that, Professor Meyer, because I think it's also an interesting question as to exactly where that ban should be, and where we've set it. But we're talking the SARB, we're talking its accountability and also the wisdom of its policy positions. Don't go anywhere. After the break, we talk the question of ownership. The South African Reserve Bank is a crucial cog in the South African economy, and tonight we ask about the SARB's accountability. Who is it accountable to, and have its policy positions been wise? Professor Meyer, Governor Kganyago says that questions about the ownership of the SARB are, quote, a distraction, and we should be focusing on other questions. Do you think that's true?
I just want to have my final point before you took the break. My biggest criticism of the Reserve Bank is that they use the same tools. Doesn't matter if it's demand pull inflation, which is a different type of inflation than we've got at the moment. We've got cost push inflation. So cost push inflation is driven by the supply side of the economy. It's driven by cost to produce. For example, the fuel price, electricity issues, municipal accounts, that drives up costs. And the Reserve Bank can increase interest rates as much as they want to, but if the fuel price increases like it's going to increase tomorrow with R2.70 for diesel, the inflation will rise again. Doesn't matter how much they increase their inflation or their interest rates, it doesn't matter, because they cannot prevent those increases. So it's a totally different environment compared to a demand pull inflation environment, which the US, for example, has. And that's why they are increasing the interest rates to pull down consumers' expenditure. But over the last 5 years, our consumer expenditure was at a 0.6% on average.
But some would say that the two problems are actually, or the two questions are actually linked, because to the extent that the SARB doesn't feel like it is really accountable to the public, it can basically take decisions which hammer certain sections, and it actually doesn't get the kind of heat, as it were, that politicians get and ministers, chance would be a fine thing, get.
So they should be accountable. They should give us more information on how they've calculated and why are they putting up interest rates exactly. Because in the current situation, to increase interest rates will not keep inflation down. We've got in the latest inflation number was 4.7% in July, but now the petrol will go up, electricity goes up, it will go up again, and let's say about 5. Will they increase interest rates again? In a very, as the previous speaker said, it's a dead patient in the ICU, the economy, hitting it with a sledgehammer by increasing the interest rates again, taking money out of the pockets of consumers, and pushing the economy down and more down.
Well, it's an interesting question. Indeed, Mr. Lowe, let's come to you on this, because I'm interested in this link between the policy and the ownership of the bank. And some say that because the bank is privately owned, there's not as much accountability to the public as if it was publicly owned, and therefore it can take decisions which are controversial. Others say that's actually a good thing, and sometimes you need that amount of independence to keep the bank on the straight and narrow, as it were. Where do you fall on this debate about the ownership of the bank?
Well, there's a lot of rhetoric here and a lot of mythology and a lot of nonsense, frankly. One can't take it seriously. There are 2 million shares and there are 800 shareholders, and the full list of every single shareholder is in the press. Many of them are Mr. Vavi's people, who are the institutions and the pension funds and the medical schemes and so on. Most of them are private individuals. They have a range of names that means they could be anybody. As Mr. Vavi said, Zulindile, when you said they belong to owned by rich people, that's just frankly nonsense. Anyone can look at that on the internet for 5 minutes and see it's not true. There are 2 million shares, 800 shareholders. None of them have more than 10,000 shares. 90% of the profits goes to the government. The shareholders get nothing. No, you don't buy a Reserve Bank share to get a return or invest. You buy it to feel patriotic and good. It's a good feel-good thing. So they're accountable, and who they are accountable to, well, firstly, hopefully they're independent. That's what the Constitution says they must be, and not be accountable to anyone. But if ownership determines accountability, then let's be clear. There are 15 people on the board of directors. 7 are elected from shareholders, which includes everybody, including public institutions and NGOs and state-owned enterprises and so on. And nobody is a big shareholder, not one. Nobody's a controlling shareholder. And so there is no profit to be made. The amount of profit is nothing. It's a joke. And the total value of all the shares owned by the private sector, not by government, is less than the Palapala farm amount. So we're talking, it's silly, it's childish. So
Okay.
just let's get to the very important point here.
And I do want to bring in Mr.
Of the
Vavi to
15
respond.
boards of the share of the thing, 8 are appointed by the president and 7 by the shareholders. And those 7 have to be one from agriculture, one from trade and industry, one from transport, whatever the sectors are that have to be financed and so on.
Sure.
So this is nonsense to say that this is something to do with shareholders.
And the
they have
governor is
nothing to
also
do with
appointed
it
by the
at all.
president.
This is
The governor as well.
This is the government, yeah.
Mr. Vavi, your response, where do you stand on the question of ownership?
Let me just say this in response to Mr. Lowe, that there are 60 million South Africans. The majority of them are pretty poor. They live in dire straits of poverty, and they are the face of inequality and unemployment. They are not part of the 800 shareholders that is mentioning. To suggest that
Some are.
to suggest that these 800 people somehow represent South Africa of 60 million people is absolutely nonsense, to use his own language. That's the first point. The second point is that, yes, we arguing that everything that the monetary policy have been used is not to advance the interest of the poorest of the poor, the 60 million South Africans. So it doesn't matter how much they're getting out of the shareholding certificate. The issue is on whose class interest are they acting every day when they increase the interest rates to the point that me and you must pay 11.75% at the bank when we purchase anything of value to our family.
Mr. Lowe
That's the crux
makes
of the
point
matter.
that there's a lot
the
of
crux of the
state
matter
control,
is
Mr.
that
Vavi.
the policies are in favor of perhaps the 800 people and
But
the rich South Africans.
What about
who
Mr.
can
Lowe's
afford
point about
to buy those,
there's actually quite a lot of state influence, if not control,
10%
already?
for the 800. 10%, it's nothing. It's irrelevant.
Sorry,
What about Mr. Lowe's point that there's already quite a lot of state influence over the appointments of the bank?
There was an appointment of the Commission of Inquiry, 11 of them, to whose interest did they act on behalf of. The appointment by the president of a certain individual drawn from the people who own the economy means absolutely nothing to the overwhelming majority of our people. And let me just reinforce the point that Danny Meyer is making. The professor is right. The inflation target policy is not for a developing country. Worst of all, when you're going to take it at between 3 and 6%. You can't do that in a country where 50% of the people that were promised liberation have become the face of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. You cannot have inflation targeting at that low level, nog aan, 3 to 6%, when we have these levels of poverty and everything that goes with that. That's the first point we wanted to make. Secondly, the Reserve Bank have indeed facilitated the basic point that I was making, to make the rich richer and the poor. Look at their policies. They have removed exchange controls that used to be the speed bumps. Fine, you will say it was Nazi policy, it was apartheid. No, those speed bumps helped to keep the resources that we so desperately need inside our country. Today, it is so easy. They've allowed these guys to move money out of this economy, and they give us reports that says between 300 and 400 billion rands every year gets moved out of this economy through mispricing and through illicit cash outflows, through all manner of other schemes, including sheer tax dodging schemes of those that have the money to be able to do that. The result of it is what you see outside the studio. Right. The poorer you are, the more poor you're going to get out of the monetary policies of the country. The rich you are, the more rich you're going to be.
Let's go to a break, and after that we'll come back to talk about some of your comments on social media, as well as the concluding thoughts from our panelists. Just a reminder, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, we did ask the South African Reserve Bank to join us on tonight's show. We'll be back after the break with concluding thoughts and a wrap-up of our debate. Welcome back to Unfiltered. This evening we're discussing the South African Reserve Bank, its place in the South African economy, and the extent to which it is an accountable institution. Professor Meyer, could I start with you and just zero in on, of course, the debate that we've been having, and feel free to intervene in whatever way you see fit, but there's also the question of the governor of the Reserve Bank and his leadership role. This recent set of controversial decisions has placed him in the position as a governor of more criticism than I've seen for many governors of the Reserve Bank. What do you make of his leadership in these controversial times for the bank?
Yes, my opinion is that he's been in the position for quite a long time now. Maybe it's time for some changes, and also changes in the monetary policy of South Africa, as well as the economic policy. I think we've been trying the same things for a number of years now, and we've walked into a brick wall in terms of what we need is high levels of growth, at least above 3% to 6% growth. And as I said, low inflation means low growth. So we have got a ceiling. We've placed the ceiling on our own growth environment with this low inflation target that we've got. Maybe we must relook that and see if we can better results if we do some changes there. We have got cost push inflation, which is driven by supply side of the economy, which the Reserve Bank and the government can do something about. They can stop these huge increases in wages, in fuel prices, in electricity prices, in municipal accounts. They can stop those huge increases and keep the inflation under control without increasing interest rates. That's really possible. That's been done in other countries in the world. And we know that cost push inflation is short term. It doesn't keep on going for long, like demand inflation. So the cost side is not a long-term situation. It will come down again. So my personal feeling is that interest rates should now be stabilized, and towards the end of the year start to come down again to support the consumers, to support the economy, and then we can start with growth and maybe have some economic policy. We don't have a plan that's been implemented, and that's our biggest problem. We have got no plan for the future at this point of time.
Your thoughts, Mr. Lowe, on the leadership of the bank, and of course any other questions in the debate that you'd like to pick up on?
I want to make it very clear that the Reserve Bank can do nothing about the issues under discussion here. Poverty, it doesn't employ people, it doesn't deal with poverty. This is government economic policy. And Zima quite rightly refers to the poor people. Absolutely, that is the people we should be concerned about. I would encourage him then to say, remove the shackles off the poor. It is a criminal offense for someone living in a shack to replace it with a brick structure. It is a criminal offense for somebody in destitution to trade, to become an informal trader, a backyard operator, whatever. We have criminalized poor people rising out of poverty. And the first thing to do is to stop causing that harm. The Reserve Bank can do absolutely nothing about that. It is not in a position to do it. It shouldn't be in it. Other departments, other agencies, the Land Bank, the provinces, the local governments, they have that job. The Reserve Bank, and also I do want to say, I'm very surprised that Professor Meyer says this idea that low inflation equals low growth. Again, everybody can check this. It's 5 minutes. Look on the internet, growth rates, inflation rates, and you will see that high growth countries have lower inflation. That's a fact. It's not debatable. So this idea that the Reserve Bank can do anything about cost-push inflation, inequality, it can do nothing. With what can be done is people like Zwelinzima Vavi saying to the government, stop making the poor people poor, liberate them, let them become free traders and to run businesses. And here where we sit in Johannesburg, I'm going to tell you, it doesn't sound like the Reserve Bank. The Joburg City Council chased 8,000 street traders off the streets overnight with private police, dogs, horses, incredible cruelty. We went to the Constitutional Court and had that reversed. First time ever that it's ever happened. Within a month, the Constitutional Court ordered the council to let them back onto the streets. So here we have the government. It's whether it's the DA or the IFP or the ANC, doesn't matter. What do? When harmless people are trying to earn an honest living, they attack them viciously, steal their goods. This is what Mr. Vavi should be worried about. Liberate the poor, liberate the job seekers, let them decide what job they want to get.
Right, let's put that to Mr. Vavi. Your view on the debate and Mr. Lowe's point.
I didn't know that Mr. Lowe can mount so much rhetoric. This is rhetoric about the poor, as if you can just wave a hand and set them out of their shackles of poverty and deprivation. That's not how the world works. Here's the reality. Every time the Reserve Bank decides to follow the terrible example that it shouldn't be following of the American governors to increase the interest rates, it is taking a conscious decision to make money more expensive, to put brakes on economic growth, to put more people in unemployment, because the more you make the money more expensive, the more it will not be affordable for small macro, even big firms to keep their workers, because they suddenly have to pay so much more for everything that they need to borrow in order to expand the production and everything that goes with it. So it's not like a Reserve Bank can do nothing. Oh, of course, it does something terrible to the economy when it keeps the repo rate at about 7.8 and chasing 8%. That's a statement against growth. The result is what we know, what we have seen today, a 0.6% and an economy that is trapped in a low growth path, where unemployment the crisis is not being resolved, where poverty inequalities are not being resolved. And unfortunately, the Reserve Bank is an active player. If you ask any governor of any Reserve Bank anywhere else in the world, they know that every time they make an intervention to keep inflation low, they are making a statement against borrowing money, and therefore they are pushing the poor deeper into poverty, and they are putting the brakes on the economy.
Right.
But let me just say, everything
Can I
has
ask you
its
to round off
history
here, because we're going to go to our final statements after
We can't compare
this.
the South Africa's economy with these levels of underdevelopment with the levels of development in Europe and other former imperialist countries.
Right.
You can't do that.
And we are
working on a particular base that is particularly very, very low.
Right. Professor Meyer, we're running out of time here, and we could have this conversation probably for 1 year rather than 1 hour. But could I get your concluding thoughts on the debate, and if you could keep them relatively brief so we can bring in the panel as we close out?
Thank you. I would say my last opinion is that I stand with this low inflation will lead to low growth for us in South Africa. There is proof of that. We have analyzed it, and it is 100% correct. We have got a supply problem and not a demand problem. So from the supply side, government departments and government policy should look at our logistics, help industries to get their products out to the harbors. We are struggling with our transportation, with our exports. We need effective government spending, as well as we need to have control over the costs that's rising so rapidly in South Africa, and it is possible to maintain and contain that. And in that process, we could have stable interest rates and growth in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Lowe, your concluding thoughts, and if you could keep them relatively brief.
Yes, well, Nzima, it's very, very simple. If you want the poor to get rich and you want the country to get rich, you look around the world. It's called research by looking, and see which countries are experiencing high growth. It's very simple and very straightforward. Look at all of the indices, whether it's the World Freedom, Economic Freedom, doesn't matter what index, Corruption Perceptions Index, Competitiveness Index, all of them show a simple thing. If you liberate and free the economy, it starts growing. And this is what all of the prosperous economies have in mind. None of them have in common that they had an easy money policy. That is just factually false.
Mr. Vavi, your concluding thoughts before we close out the show?
Well, in our view, change the mandate of the Reserve Bank, change the ownership of the Reserve Bank and put it in the hands of the South African people, change the monetary policies, scrap the inflation targeting policy, stop business from taking money out of the economy, and bring back exchange controls to make sure that we keep the money here, stop corruption, stop the business from looting the procurement budgets, change the fiscal monetary policy, overall the structure of the South Africa's economy, stop deindustrialization by ensuring that the ownership patterns, the involvement of black people in particular in owning of the land and of resources is such that you can support a broader redistribution strategy that can help so many people out of poverty. No miracles. You have to do that. Everything that have been done so far have simply dismally failed.
Mr. Vavi, Mr. Lowe, Professor Meyer, thank you very much for a spirited and interesting and fascinating conversation on the role of the South African Reserve Bank. From the Palapala statement to questions of inflation targeting and the ownership of the bank, we've analyzed whether the South African Reserve Bank is accountable enough to the South African people and whether its policy direction in the last decade has been wise. Let's continue this conversation on social media. Thank you for joining us on Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.